All right, so a few things before we get started here. I'll post another announcement about this, although I've posted some and posted one before the exam. If you're looking for extra help outside of the CL sessions, my office hours, or the TA office hours, there's also those additional tutoring sessions in Wiley Hall, room 329, on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights. Right? So don't reserve these just for the week of exams. You can go there any week. Right? So I'll post an announcement just to remind you again what those times are. But I've had some people ask for some outside things. That's one of them that I've mentioned before. That's a good one to kind of maybe take advantage of. Okay. Speaking of TA office hours, I put up an announcement this morning. One of my TAs is sick, and so they're going to move their office hours. Usually, I think they're from today from 11 to 12, 11 to 2. They're going to have those on Friday instead this week. Okay. I wanted to remind you that this Friday, at the end of the day, what is due? The second Canvas discussion. So the original post, tie that into some of the data that was provided on that BLS data source, responded to other students. That needs to all be done by the end of the day, Friday, to get those points. That category is weighted relatively high. It's meant to be as long as you're participating in that. You should be able to get all the points there. That's going to kind of help your grade if you're, didn't do as well in the exam as you had hoped. Okay? The other thing I'll also mention, I'm attending a lot of these things right now and listening to things about generative AI tools. So, I'm not dumb. And as I talk to people more, I know that a lot of you are using them, which is fine. I think they're a really useful tool. I will just kind of give a blanket statement without going into too much in depth. And if you stop by to review your exam, I know a lot of you are like using these to generate questions, things for yourself. I'll just give you a little bit of pause. They're not great with graphs. They pull from the web, which sometimes has things of level of difficulty above or below what we're covering. And so some of the answers that it's going to give you aren't right? So I'd be a little bit cautious in using that. The materials I give you, I can guarantee are at the same level of difficulty as what you'll have to kind of cover in the quiz or the exams that we have. But I will say, one thing I heard, a really useful tool, not only for you, but also for me to clear up my inbox a little bit. If you have questions, like general questions about the class, like when are my office hours or when are the CL sessions, if you just throw in the syllabus to any generative AI tool and ask it the question, it's going to be able to pull from that syllabus and give you the answer pretty quickly, right? That way you don't have to wait for me to respond, especially on Tuesday, Thursdays. I teach most of the day. You might not get a response right away. Just kind of a thing to think about how you can use that tool. Throw in the syllabus in the first week of slides. If you have a general question about the class, just in terms of like structure and that, he does a pretty good job of answering those questions, right? And you don't have to wait for my response. The other thing I'll mention is on that last quiz, my intent was to give everybody credit for 11 and 12 based off what we covered last week. So we're going to cover subsidies today. Question 11 we technically covered last week, but we're going to continue to look at things similar to that. So I felt as though we were a little rushed in discussing it, and so I wanted to kind of give everyone credit. Some people didn't read the prompts carefully in the questions where I told you what to do. So I had them regraded this morning. So at 11, 12, everyone should now have full credit for those questions. But they are good ones to go back and review because you can see what the correct answer should have been, other than just me telling you the answer when we get closer to that exam. Okay? Any housekeeping, logistic questions before we get started on new material here today? Okay? So we will start with subsidies. Okay? So we talked about taxes last class. And just to kind of give us a prelude to it, remember, what did we say about taxes? If I impose an additional cost on the market, am I going to get more or less than I was before? If I increase the cost, either to producers or consumers, I'm going to get less. Right? So we saw the quantity was too low, which created deadweight loss. It also started to create a difference between the price that consumers pay and the price that sellers keep. Subsidies are going to do a very similar thing, right? Everything just kind of gets flipped on its head, right? So we'll first start out thinking about an example where we're giving people money instead of taxing. So giving people money for doing something, that's going to be a subsidy. We'll first start to think about maybe I'm going to give subsidies to, I don't know, if I'm trying to attend higher education. Well, think about it this way. If we wanted to motivate there to be more electric vehicles, I could give producers of vehicles an additional amount of money if they produce electric compared to gas-powered vehicles. So the government is giving producers money. So what represents a producer's marginal costs? Got to know this. We're building on things that we talked about before. What represents producer's marginal costs? Supply curve. So if I'm then giving them money, their costs are whatever that was before. So let's say it was, $50,000 to produce this vehicle. If the government now gives you $10,000, what was the total cost of the firm? They spent $50,000 to create it. The government gave them $10,000. Real cost was only $40,000. So essentially, with a subsidy, I'm lowering the cost of producers. So what's going to happen to my supply curve? If I'm lowering the cost, it's going to increase, right? So I think about my old equilibrium quantity and price. My new supply curve, when I give producers subsidies, is now going to be higher. Or essentially, I'm lowering their cost at every single quantity. So it works the exact opposite. With taxes, we decrease. If it was tax on producers, we decrease supply. Tax on consumers, we decrease demand. In the slides, I'll work through an example where we give subsidies to producers, and then we'll look at how we would work the same model, but subsidies to consumers. So when I impose a subsidy, what happens is what looks like my new equilibrium point is not going to be the price to both producers and consumers, right? Just like taxes, those two things are now different. So with a tax, we said it hurt producers and consumers. So if it hurts consumers, what did it do to the price of the tax? It increased. If it hurt producers, what did it do to the price that sellers keep? Lowered. If subsidies instead help producers and consumers, the exact opposite of a tax, the price that the seller gets to keep should now be higher, and the price consumers pay should now be lower. So it looks like our new equilibrium price with producer subsidies now represents a lower price that the consumer is going to pay. So when I go to buy this electric vehicle, I, as the consumer, only pay $40,000. But what's the price that sellers keep? I give them $40,000, but they also get an additional $10,000 from the government. So their total amount they keep would be $50,000, right? So what's the difference between this supply curve and the supply curve with the subsidy? The difference would just be the value of the subsidy. Just like the difference between our supply curve and the supply curve of the tax was the value of the tax. So this is the new price consumers pay. What will be the price that sellers keep? That amount plus whatever that subsidy is. So what would the value of my subsidy be in this example? The difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy at any quantity. So at this quantity of 25, the difference between those curves would be what? 400 to 600 or 200. So this would represent a $200 subsidy. As a result, what happened to the quantity in the market? Well, the old equilibrium, where supply was equal to demand, was at a quantity of 15. What is the new quantity after the subsidy? Higher. If I give producers more money for making something, they're going to want to produce more than before. So unlike taxes, I had the underproduction of a good. Now I'm going to have the overproduction. So if I overproduce something, if we think about what is that going to create? If I move away from the equilibrium point of the market, at the equilibrium point, that is where total surplus in the market is maximized. So if I move away from that point, I have a lower level of total surplus. What have I created? Well, if I have less surplus, I'm going from the maximum to somewhere else, I've created deadweight loss. So here, what is deadweight loss? And we talked about total surplus. Total surplus in the market was just the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs in the market, or the difference between my supply and demand curve. So when I have a subsidy, right, I can think about it working this way. All right, so I've got my supply curve, I've got my demand curve. Here's my supply curve with the subsidy. Here's where the market was before, so like our old equilibrium. The new quantity after the subsidy is going to be out here. So for every unit that was overproduced relative to where the market was in equilibrium, what's going to be true about the marginal costs and the marginal benefits? the marginal costs are now above the marginal benefits. So if the marginal costs are higher, for every unit in this range, what type of surplus exists? If the costs are higher than the benefits, total surplus would be negative. So every unit that I'm overproducing by, I'm creating negative surplus, which is a loss of total surplus, or this would represent my deadweight loss. Now notice what's interesting about my deadweight loss with a subsidy. What is the height of this triangle always going to be? Well, if it's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy, the height would always be the value of the subsidy, right? What is the base of this triangle always going to be? It's the amount of units that I'm overproducing by, right? So you can kind of think about it as, for all those units I'm overproducing times the value of that subsidy, that's going to be calculating deadweight loss. Now, because we have linear supply and demand curves, we also have to then multiply it by the half, right? It's a shape of a triangle, but essentially where that deadweight loss comes from is that every unit we're overproducing in the market, it's costing the government some money, right? So if I then, instead of taxes, we had total revenue, if the government is giving people money to do something, I now don't have tax revenue, I have subsidy expenditures, right? Or the government doesn't have revenue, it's going to have some expenditures. So before we kind of go back to the slides and look at this, what is my total government expenditure going to be? Well, if tax revenue was the value of the tax times the quantity sold after the tax, government expenditures for every unit, they're giving whatever the value of the subsidy is times the quantity we see after the subsidy. So now we calculate total surplus. We have producer and consumer surplus, but we also have government expenditures, which if it's an expenditure, what type of surplus will that be? Negative. So I'm going to go through some animations where we look at this and why deadweight loss is what it is. And then we'll come back to thinking about what if we give subsidies to consumers instead? Okay. So here I've kind of foreshadowed what the deadweight loss looks like, but let's look at it in a slightly different way. So let's say I have this market, it's equilibrium. What would that blue triangle represent? It's the triangle on top, so consumer surplus. Or what is that triangle attached to? The demand curve. The area below demand but above the price, that was consumer surplus. The red triangle represents producer surplus. It's attached to the supply curve. The area below the price they receive but above their supply curve or their marginal costs. So if instead we have a subsidy, right? So we said that's going to cause overproduction of this good, right? Instead of 15 units, we now get 25. Well, for every one of those units, we still have maybe a gain, just like with a tax get hurt producers and consumers. Subsidies will help producers and consumers. So compared to what it was before, if we now think about where is producer and consumer surplus, well, now the price that consumers keep, or have to, sorry, not the price that consumers pay is this lower price of 400. So if I now want consumer surplus, it's the area above that price, but still below our, looking at consumers, the demand curve. Right? So I've got consumer surplus is this now larger triangle. Now, what is producer surplus? Well, the price that sellers keep is now not 500, it is 600. So producer surplus is the area underneath that new price that they get to keep, but above whatever their marginal costs were, which represented by the supply curve. So we have gains to both producer and consumer surplus. You notice kind of there's an area in the middle that's now getting double counted. So why do we have deadweight loss? Well, we no longer just have producers and consumers, we also now have the government. And now they don't have tax revenue, they have subsidy expenditures, right? A negative amount of surplus. So let's think, I already told you how you would think about what government expenditure is. It's the value of the subsidy times the quantity sold after the subsidy. So what is the height of this larger rectangle here? The difference between supply and supply with a subsidy is the value of the subsidy. What is the base or the width of this rectangle? Quantity sold after the subsidy. So what would this larger rectangle represent? Government expenditure. So you can kind of notice, even though we had gains to producer and consumer surplus, and there was an area that's getting double counted, it's all offset by this now government expenditure. Right? So kind of these gains to producers and consumers are canceled out by this government expenditure, but there's this area in the middle, this white triangle. It wasn't producer or consumer surplus, but it was government expenditures. So it should represent a negative value surplus, or essentially that white triangle is going to be deadweight loss, right? It was part of government expenditure that wasn't offset by producer or consumer surplus gains. Okay? Now, I said another way to think about that is it's the difference between the supply and supply curve with a subsidy. So the value of the subsidy times the number of units we were overproducing by, and it's a triangle, so times a half. Now, this isn't the most technical way of remembering it. When we looked at taxes, we said with a tax, we actually underproduce. So we were missing out on some surplus. So if we wanted, we're underproducing, the market wants the quantity to be higher. Our deadweight loss triangle pointed to the right. With a subsidy, we're actually overproducing. So the efficient point of the market is actually at a lower quantity. So what direction does our deadweight loss triangle point to? The left. It's not the most technical way of remembering it, but that'll always be the case. And the reason why that is deadweight loss is because it's for every unit that we're overproducing by, what's the difference between the marginal cost in the market, the supply curve, and the marginal benefits, the demand curve? Well, the costs are higher, so for every unit in that range, we're creating negative surplus. A loss of surplus would be deadweight loss. Okay, so it works almost exactly the opposite of taxes. We see a benefit to both producers and consumers, but that's offset by this huge government expenditure. Now, do the producers and consumers in a subsidy market, do they like the subsidy? Well, if producer and consumer surplus went up, yeah, right? Who doesn't like that? The government, or how do government expenditures paid for? All of us, right? And so subsidies are going to lead to deadweight loss, kind of not just for the individuals in the market, but for society overall, right? We're thinking about now including government into our society, right? Our market, okay? So I want to show you, and this will get to be, and I'll admit, kind of a convoluted graph. I will try to use colors and shading in a way. I'll try to make it clear what's going on. It'll be a little bit difficult, but you can kind of line it up with like the animations that we were using in the slides, okay? So if instead of producer subsidies, let's say I instead think about consumer subsidies, okay? So here was kind of the old market equilibrium, and we could think about, here was my marker works here, there we go. My like old equilibrium price. If I give subsidies to consumers, what is going to shift here? My demand curve. So my marginal benefit will be whatever it was before. So once again, if a lot of you who are going to college right now, you get subsidized loans or you get Pell Grants, things that essentially those are subsidies, right? They're giving you money for consuming a college education. Now you still have an amount that you have to pay, but you're still getting some money from the government. So at every single point, your marginal benefit is whatever it was before, plus whatever the value of that subsidy is. So with the subsidy, if we give it to consumers, that would increase our demand curve. Just like if we gave subsidies to producers, that increased our supply curve. So what looks like the new equilibrium price, well, first of all, we'll stick with the easy part. The new equilibrium quantity after the subsidy is now out here. So just like when we gave subsidies to producers, what do we get with a subsidy? We get overproduction, right? Relative to that efficient point of the market. Now, what is this new price representing? Well, we said subsidies help producers and consumers. So if I have a subsidy, if the price is higher than it was before, who is that going to benefit? Producers. So this now represents the price that producers or sellers keep. Which means if I have to spend, let's say I want to buy an electric vehicle and I instead give the subsidies to consumers. When I go to the dealership and I pay $50,000, if the subsidy the government gives me, so I can think about here, it's like 50,000. If the subsidy is 5,000, how much did I actually pay as a consumer? Well, I handed over 50,000, the government gave me 5, so I actually only had to pay 45,000, right? Or the price that the consumer pays will now be lower than what it was before. So that's a good thing for consumers. The price is now lower relative. See if this comes back on to us. Doesn't, I'm going to be annoyed. There we go. All right. So the price the consumer pays is now lower. That benefits consumers. The price sellers keep is higher. That benefits producers. So let's think about, where is consumer surplus? So we said last class or last week, consumer surplus is the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers. Their marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve, and their marginal cost is the price they have to pay. So where is consumer surplus here? Well, it's the area above the price they pay, but below their marginal benefit, which is represented by the demand curve. So consumer surplus after the subsidy is this entire area here, right? So this kind of blue area is the consumer surplus after the subsidy. Now, what is producer surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers. The marginal benefit is represented by the price they get to keep. Marginal cost to producers is represented by our supply curve. So the difference now between the price sellers keep and the supply curve would be represented by this entire area. So kind of notice there was gains to producer surplus here, gains to consumer surplus here, and then this area in the middle got double counted. Okay? So without the subsidy, the difference between supply and demand was just this. That was our total surplus. After the subsidy, we now have this area and this area, which were gains to producer and consumer surplus, and this area in the middle is getting double counted. Who else do we have to factor in, though, if we have subsidies? The government, right? So we said, what would the height of this rectangle represent? The value of the subsidy. The width would now represent the quantity sold after the subsidy. So this rectangle in the middle represents total government expenditure. So it cancels out this gain to producer and consumer surplus. The area that was double counted, well, if I double count something and then I subtract it, what am I left with? So 1 times 2 is 2, minus 1 is 1. All right, I'm not double counting any. Right? It is what it was before. So I still have the same total surplus. These areas are offset by this huge government expenditure. But I also have this area over here, which is government expenditure not offset by gains to producers or consumers. So if I have increase in government expenditures and there's no gains to producers or consumers to offset it, this would represent what? Deadweight loss, which is exactly what we got if we subsidize producers. So it doesn't matter who we subsidize, just like it didn't matter who we tax. It is going to benefit both producers and consumers, but cause some deadweight loss. Okay? I know this is, once again, when you're putting this all in the same graph, it gets kind of tricky to see, which is why I first went through those animations in the slides to kind of help see where these areas are being offset. Now, I try to draw vertical, horizontal lines for producer and consumer surplus, diagonal lines for that government expenditure. So the same story is with subsidies, we get the overproduction of the good. that overproduction is going to cause dead weight loss, which if I have overproduction, that means that to get the efficient point, I actually want less. So my dead weight loss triangle is pointing to the left. Not the most technical way of remembering it, but that's another kind of good way to think about it. Any questions here on subsidies? So now if you go back to that 12th question on the quiz, you should be able to hopefully kind of think through it and kind of get to the correct answer given what we've talked about. Questions on that moving forward? Okay. All right. So let's move on to kind of the next topic, and then we'll kind of tie this into what we just talked about, taxes and subsidies. But we're going to kind of switch gears here a little bit. Okay? We're going to talk about something called externalities, right? This is where, even if you look at the book, I'm going to simplify what I expect you to know a little bit. Okay? So anything that you're expected to know is just what we cover in class. So an externality is going to be an additional cost or benefit to people that aren't involved in the market. So the market, the decisions are made. We know that the equilibrium will be where the private marginal costs are equal to the private marginal benefits. So just the marginal costs and marginal benefits to the people in that market. The problem is, who is someone else that might bear an additional cost or benefit to the rest of society? So I'll give you some examples, right? So I think about, like, if I'm producing oil, right, and I'm a company, what am I likely also producing? In the production process, I'm getting a lot of pollution. So even if I have an electric vehicle and I'm not a producer or a consumer of oil, I have to bear the cost of the pollution. I'm somebody outside that market who has an additional cost because that market exists. So when we talk about where is the efficient point for society, it should factor in the producers and consumers in that market, but also these people who are incurring this additional cost that are outside the market. So that would be a negative production externality. It's an external cost that comes from the production of a good. Now, we also have negative consumption externalities. So this would be like, I don't smoke, so I'm not a producer or a consumer of cigarettes. But if I'm walking downtown and somebody's chain smoking outside of a restaurant, I have to walk through it. I have to bear this additional cost where I don't really like the smell of smoke. I have to walk through it, right? Someone consuming that product is going to bear an additional cost onto me, right? I'm not involved in that market, but I'm a member of society who has to incur this additional cost. Now, it doesn't matter if we have negative consumption or production externalities. We're going to model them the same way in this class. You can technically model them in a different way. If we have time on Thursday, I might show you that. But I'm only going to expect you to know how to model them the way we'll model them here today. So it doesn't matter where they come from. We just care that they're a negative externality. It's an additional cost to somebody outside the market. Now, we also can have additional benefits to people outside the market or positive externalities. So some examples of like a positive externality. An example I usually use is like the production of a good. So if I'm like a apple farmer, I don't know, that's even the right term, like a farmer that has apple trees or peach trees. If I don't have any bee, I'm not producing honey, but somebody a mile down the road is. So there's a beekeeper down the road, and I don't buy honey, I don't produce it. I'm not involved in that market. But the fact that there's someone beekeeping a mile down the road, those bees help pollinate my fruit trees, create a positive externality onto me, right? So I'm not involved in the honey or the beekeeping market, but I get an additional benefit from the production of that good. Now, what's probably more examples of are positive consumption externalities. So I'll use two examples. One, when you chose to go to college, did you choose to do so because it was going to benefit other people, or you thought it was going to benefit you in higher wages? My guess is you thought it's going to benefit me in higher wages. You made a decision based off of your private marginal benefit, but you getting a college degree, you're going to potentially come up with inventions, new products, improvement in the returns that maybe there are for different financial products, like, working for these financial companies. So you getting a college degree is going to benefit people who don't have a college degree, who aren't even involved in that market. That's a positive consumption externality. We'll say, separate example, let's assume I'm vaccine hesitant, right? I didn't want to get the COVID vaccine. If you chose to get it because you wanted to protect yourself, I'm going to benefit from the fact that everybody in this front row has the COVID vaccine because I now can't get it. Right? You made a decision based off of your private marginal benefit. It benefited me even though I'm not involved in the market at all. I'm not a producer or a consumer of vaccines. So that would be another example of a positive consumption measure. So here we're thinking about even people not involved in the markets are going to incur an additional cost or benefit from the people that are. Okay? So we'll kind of set this example. We'll think through it. We'll kind of draw some examples of what this looks like. So here's where we're going to start to make some differentiations. The demand curve told us the private marginal benefits. The marginal benefits to only the consumers in that market. The supply curve is going to tell us the private marginal cost. The marginal cost only to the people who are producing or supplying in the market. Now, if we think about a negative externality, if I want to know what society's costs are, society's costs will be whatever the cost of producers were, but plus some additional amount to people outside that market. So my marginal social cost at every quantity should be, well, if it includes the marginal cost of producers plus some additional amount, it's going to look like it's a higher supply curve or a decrease in the supply curve. So if we think about society's supply curve, I'll skip ahead a little bit here. Society's supply curve factors in that external cost. So if we almost want to think about like that green line is telling us what society's marginal costs are. Or you can almost think about it, it's society's cost, society's supply curve. So at every single quantity, what should be the difference between the private marginal costs and society's marginal costs? The only additional thing society's marginal cost factor in is that external cost, or if we could put a dollar valuation to that negative externality. So before that negative externality, the market simply chose the equilibrium based on where supply was equal to demand, right? Just like when we had individual decision making way back in module 1, people chose to do something as long as the marginal benefit was greater than or equal to the marginal cost. They stopped at the point where they're equal. The markets do the same thing, but it was where the marginal benefit to consumers was equal to the marginal cost of producers, and they stopped at the point where they're equal, and where supply was equal to demand. So here was our old equilibrium, don't trip and fall, to the market, right? Well, if I have society and I have a higher marginal cost curve, where is society going to want this equilibrium to be? Okay. So we'll do a little foreshadowing. The slides have some of this, which will kind of almost be like review. So I want to give you kind of an idea about what's happening in this market. Okay. So if I've got my supply and demand curve, this represented my private marginal benefits and my private marginal costs. So I can think about my marginal social costs. If I have a negative externality, it's going to be whatever my private marginal costs were plus this additional or this external cost. This cost is someone outside the market. Right? So you can almost think about this as like if we could put a per dollar or a per unit valuation on what that negative externality is. So you'll notice if I want to know what that external cost is, if I just rearrange this equation a little bit, my marginal social cost minus the marginal cost tells me the value of that external cost. So when I'm thinking about graphing society's marginal costs, they should be higher at every single quantity, or what looks like, similar to what we've done before, it looks kind of like a decrease in supply. So these marginal social costs, it's higher at every single point. What should the difference between society's costs and the private marginal cost of producers be? The value of that negative externality, right? Just kind of like when we were thinking about the value of a tax, it was the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve for the tax. Excuse me. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So I said one way to think about this is it's almost like the marginal social cost is the supply curve for society. Now, are there any additional benefits? No, we haven't included those in our model. So where is society's marginal benefit? Well, if there's no positive externalities, it would simply be whatever the private marginal benefits are. All right, we only have a negative externality here. So where does society want this quantity to be? Well, we always want things to be where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. But for society, that's where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So that would be what? This point right here. So society wants the quantity to be here. The market chooses the quantity where supply is equal to demand. So if I have a negative externality, what is the market doing? Relative to where society wants it, the market would be overproducing. So the reason why is because society takes into consideration these additional costs. Okay. Any questions or anything before I start adding some stuff in? I said another way to think about the marginal social cost is it would be like society supply curve. All right. That doesn't help. We don't have to use that, but I just adding it in there just kind of give a little more context. Another way to think about what that marginal social cost would represent. So if the market overproduces relative to that efficient point for society, well, if it's the efficient point for society, where would society's total surplus be maximized? At the efficient point for society. So if the market overproduces, what are we going to see created for society? Deadweight loss. Now, this is very similar to subsidies. With subsidies, we said we moved the market to a point where it was overproducing. So what direction did our deadweight loss triangle point to? If we actually, as society, want less of this good, the overproduction of it, our triangle pointed to be left. Now let's think about why, right? Let's think about where that deadweight loss triangle would be. If I'm overproducing for every unit in this range that the market is producing, what is the total surplus to society? It's the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social cost. At every single one of these units, what's true about my marginal social costs relative to my marginal social benefits? The costs are higher. So for every unit in this range, to society, total surplus is actually going to be negative, right? The marginal social costs are greater than the marginal social benefits. So when the market chooses this higher quantity, for every unit in this range, for society, they've created negative surplus or they've created deadweight loss. And sure enough, just like I said with subsidies, when the market overproduces, what direction does that deadweight loss triangle point to? The left. We want less of this good for society, right? Now, the reason why, technically, is because for every one of these units, the market is overproducing relative to the point society wants. The loss to society is the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. Questions here before we begin? Okay. So I'm going to show you a different way of thinking about this using animations. Once again, I could draw in consumer producer surplus. It gets a little bit tricky. I might do that eventually, but I want to take a look at it on the slides first. It's a little bit easier for me to show you some animations. Okay? So we said with a negative externality that society's supply curve or the marginal social cost is going to be that those social costs are high. Okay? So if I then think about where is the efficient point for society, it's going to be here at a quantity that was lower. There we go. Sorry, than what the market wanted. Okay. So every unit the market was overproducing, we said the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost, that's what was creating our deadweight loss. So we kind of already drew this out and I added some things that are probably even better than this slide. Okay. So another way of thinking about this is, well, I already kind of foreshadowed it, but if the market is overproducing, so society wants less of this good, how do we get less of a good? We could have the government impose a tax. So I don't think we'll have time quite to get there today, but to kind of foreshadow what we'll start with on Thursday, if we have these negative externalities, we know the market is overproducing, to get back to that efficient point for society, we could use a tax. Okay? And we'll talk more about that next class. Okay? Now, another way of thinking about why deadweight loss is what it is, but also I could ask you questions about if there is a negative externality to calculate producer and consumer surplus, but also the additional cost to society. So if I had this market and it's operating on its own, what point will the market end up at? Where supply is equal to demand, or where the private marginal benefits are equal to the private marginal costs. So where my supply and demand curve intersect, right? So if I was at that efficient point for the market, what would consumer and producer surplus be? Goes back to exactly how we calculated it before. Consumer surplus, the area above the price, below the demand curve. Producer surplus, the area below the price, but above our supply curve. Once again, anytime you see the word consumer, what should you attach that to? The demand curve. Anytime you see the word producer, you should be thinking about or connect that to the supply curve. Now, if I was thinking about instead of the market, if I was thinking about, well, where is society's surplus? So if society could choose the efficient point of the market, right? The market does what it wants. But if society could come in and say, I want you to be at this quantity because that is where total surplus for society is maximized, I would just simply go to the point or go to the quantity where the marginal social benefit was equal to the marginal social cost. Our social cost being higher than the private marginal cost because they factor in that some people outside this market are being hurt by pollution or these negative externalities. So the efficient point for society is at this lower quantity. What is total surplus? It's the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. So if we think about society's total surplus, for every unit that society wants, the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost will be represented by this black area here. Okay. So if we were at the efficient point for society, this would be total surplus. Now, we know the market will not choose that point. They're going to choose a quantity that was actually higher. So initially, you might look at this and think, well, that triangle is larger than when I was looking at before, so how am I getting deadweight loss here? Well, if I think about the loss that exists to society, if I could put a per dollar amount on every unit that represented the external cost or the value of the negative externality, what would that be represented by here? The difference between my private marginal costs and society's marginal costs. So if I look here, if I kind of try to eyeball this, looks like 45 and 70. So what's the value of my external cost or the value of my negative externality for every unit? So if it's the difference between these two curves at every quantity, the difference between 60 and 35 would be $25. I could use that any quantity. If I go over here, the marginal social cost is 85, private marginal cost is 60. Sure enough, I get that same external cost or negative externality valuation of $25. So if on every unit, society is losing $25 and the market chooses this quantity of what, 55, what's the total cost to people outside the market or the total cost to society? $25 in every unit times 55 units that are being produced and sold in the market. What would that be represented by? Well, if I think about my marginal social cost curve, the difference between the marginal social and the private marginal cost, that just represented my $25 negative externality, external cost. Now, it's not a rectangle, it's a parallelogram here. But how do I find the area of a parallelogram? Height times the base, right? So here, the height is the value of the external cost, or 25. The base is the quantity the market chooses. 20 times 50, 25 times 55 is what we said before, is the total cost to society. So even though I have producer and consumer surplus here, notice this like red shaded area. I know it's not like shaded, but I was trying to kind of show you that what's offsetting. even though there's gains to producer and consumer surplus from not being at that efficient point for society, what is there when I see the market go to that higher quantity? There's also external costs to other people. So this producer and consumer surplus would represent producer and consumer surplus that are offset by external costs to people outside this market. Now, there's also a triangle where this would still represent part of the external cost to society, but it's the part of cost to society that isn't offset by any gains to producer or consumer surplus. So that kind of red shaded area where it crosses over producer and consumer surplus, well, producer and consumer surplus are a good thing. That would add to total surplus for society. But the external cost is a bad thing. They offset each other. But then I have this area that isn't offset by producer or consumer surplus. It simply represents an additional cost to society. That's my deadweight loss. Just a different way of thinking about why that triangle represents the deadweight loss. Now, once again, we could think about why this is deadweight loss. So where is the deadweight loss coming from? It's coming from the fact that the market is overproducing. So for every unit in between where society wanted this quantity to be, so it looks like a quantity of, if I'm following this correctly, 40. The market stops at a quantity of 55. I'm producing 15 additional units. Now, the loss of surplus to society is the difference between the marginal social costs and the marginal social benefits. For each one of those 15 units, what am I losing? The difference between my marginal social costs and my marginal social benefits. So we said, notice, what is the height of this triangle always going to represent? The external cost, right? It's the difference between my marginal social cost and my private marginal cost. What is the base of that triangle always going to represent? Well, if it's the quantity that the market gives and the quantity that's sufficient for society, that would represent the number of units the market overproduced by. And then because we have linear supply and demand curves, our deadweight loss would be kind of multiplied by half to get that area. Okay? So different ways of thinking about that deadweight loss and why it is what it is. Any questions on that before I add some stuff in here? Now we'll notice, right? The market is overproducing, right? So if I want less of that good, what direction is my deadweight loss triangle pointing towards? To the left. All right, not the most technical way of remembering it, but that's another way to think about this. Okay. So if we instead flip everything on its head, instead of thinking about negative externalities, we think about positive externalities. Okay. So I'll kind of walk through the animations and then maybe I'll draw something out first, and then we'll kind of walk through the animations. So let's think about if instead I have positive externalities, right? So I've got my old supply, which represents the private marginal costs, my old demand curve, which represents private marginal benefits. What is my marginal social benefit? It's the marginal benefit that exists to the consumers. But if I have a positive externality, there won't be an additional cost. There's now going to be an additional or external benefit. So where is the marginal social benefit curve going to be? Well, every quantity, it'll be the marginal benefits to consumers plus an additional amount. So my marginal social benefits will now be up here. We don't have any negative externalities. We only now have positive externalities. So we could think about where was the market, or where is the market going to get to? Here will be our equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand. Now, if I don't have any negative externalities, where's my marginal social cost curve going to be? So what would my marginal social cost curve be? My private marginal cost plus that negative externality. But if I don't have negative externalities, what is my marginal social cost curve? Simply the supply curve. Just like when we have negative externalities, our marginal social benefit curve was simply the demand curve. So where does society want the quantity to be? Wherever the marginal social benefits are equal to the marginal social costs. Right? So society wants this quantity to be out here. Okay? So now what do we have? What is the market now producing relative to the point where society wants that quantity to be? The market is producing a quantity that's lower or underproducing. So now our deadweight loss is not going to come from the overproduction of the good, but it's going to come from the underproduction. When you make a decision to go get a college degree, you make it based off of your private marginal benefits. You don't factor in that you might be benefiting other people in society once you have that college degree, right? Now, I guess if you're like a really good person, maybe you made the decision factoring that in. But most of us, I think, we're operating of making decisions off of our private marginal benefits. So let's think about where our deadweight loss comes from. Well, first of all, if I have the underproduction, the efficient point for society is higher. What direction should my deadweight loss triangle point to? The right. Now, the most technical way of remembering this, but hopefully when I identify this in the graph, my deadweight loss triangle is pointing to the left, right? Society wants a higher quantity than what the equilibrium quantity in the market is. So if the market stops here, what am I missing out on? All of these units in the middle, what is total surplus to society? It's the difference between my marginal social benefits and my marginal social costs. Okay? So for every unit in this range, the difference between my marginal social benefits and my marginal social costs, this would represent positive surplus to society that we no longer see because the market stops at a quantity that's too low. Sure enough, we had underproduction. What direction does our deadweight loss triangle point to? The right. We want more of this good. Okay. Now, what would the height of this triangle that represents deadweight loss represent? Well, the difference between my marginal social costs and my marginal social benefits and my private marginal benefits, that difference is just the external benefit. Or I could think about this as like if I could put a per unit dollar valuation of that positive externality. And then what is the base of that triangle always going to be? How much I'm underproducing by. The number of units I'm not seeing the market produce relative to that efficient point for society. Any questions on this before I show you a slightly different way of thinking about why that's a deadweight loss? Okay. So let's look at this in a slightly different context. I can throw some animations that might help it here. Okay. So we talked through this already, right? It's an additional benefit that exists with positive externalities. So we're going to get kind of that underproduction of the good. So if I was to think about a graph like this, what would be the value of the external benefit? Well, it's the difference at any quantity between my marginal social benefits and my private marginal benefit. So if I look here, the difference in between these two is what? 50, 70. So the value of my external benefit or the per unit dollar valuation of that positive externality would be 20. I could look at any quantity. So if I look down here, the difference would be 60 and 40. Sure enough, I get the same valuation for that positive externality or the external benefit of $20. Now, the market is going to stop at what quantity? The market chooses the equilibrium where supply is equal to, oh no. The market chooses the equilibrium where supply is equal to demand. This should be automatic at this point. If not, we got to get this down, right? This is where we just keep reusing things that we talked about all the way back in module 3. So the market chooses where supply is equal to demand because that's where the private marginal benefits are equal to the private marginal costs. So that's going to be here at what? A quantity of 30. Now society, they would make, if they could make the choice for this market, they can't, they're not involved in it, but if they could, right, we would want to choose the quantity where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost, or this higher quantity of 40. So the market is underproducing, which we said, okay, what surplus are we missing out on? Right? It's going to be all of those units that we're not seeing the market producing, the difference between our supply and demand curve, right? Oops. Or this kind of triangle that points to the right would represent our deadweight loss. So I kind of already drew this out, just another kind of depiction of it if you're looking just at the slides, maybe people who weren't in class, right? But this is going to be the same thing that we drew out for identifying deadweight loss. Now, the other way of thinking about why that is deadweight loss. So I have marginal social benefit, which is higher than the private marginal benefit here. So I have an example of a positive externality. Okay. Now here, if I wanted to find the valuation of that positive externality, once again, I could look at the difference between this demand curve or the private marginal benefits and those marginal social benefits. So if I look here, that would be what? 65 and I don't know, 95. So here I have an external benefit of $30. Now the market is going to choose this lower quantity of 55, where supply is equal to demand. Society wants it to be, it's not quite crossing here, but close to what? 70. So the market is underproducing. Where would total surplus be for society if I was at that efficient point for society? What would be the difference between my marginal social benefits and my marginal social costs? So if I was at that efficient point for society, this black area, the difference between marginal social benefits and marginal social costs, is the total surplus that would exist to society. Well, I'm not at that quantity. The market chooses a quantity that's too low. So let's think about, if I look at that market quantity, I could calculate, once again, consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus, less technical, always the triangle on top. Producer surplus, the triangle on the bottom. Or consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and price, right? Consumer surplus attached to demand. Producer surplus is the area between the price and the supply curve. Producer surplus attached to that supply curve. Now, for every unit up to this quantity that the market chooses, what is the external benefit for every unit? Well, it's just the difference between my private marginal benefits and my social marginal benefits. So for every unit here, I'm making, or society, I shouldn't say they're making, society is being benefited by $30. But if there's 55 total units being sold, what's the total benefit to society? 30 times 55, right? The value of the external benefit times every single unit we see the market produce and sell. So the market stops that quantity of 55. For every unit, society benefits by whatever the valuation, that per unit valuation of the external benefit is. So when I'm talking about society's total surplus, it's consumer plus producer surplus plus the additional gain to society from this positive externality. Or another way of thinking about it, up to the quantity that the market chooses, total surplus to society, if I don't want to break it down, would just be the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost. But if we wanted to, we could break that down into producer, consumer surplus, and the area of this parallelogram would represent the external benefit to society. Why? Because what's the height of that parallelogram? The external benefit. What would be the base? The quantity the market chooses. So that would be the total benefit to society, the quantity that's sold and produced and sold in the market, times the value of the external benefit on every single unit. Now, because the market chose this lower quantity, what are we missing out on? Well, if we were at that efficient point for society, we would have all of these social benefits and these additional social costs So we're missing out on all of what could be positive surplus to society because the market stopped at a point where the marginal social benefit was still greater than marginal social cost. It didn't go to the point, right? As long as the marginal benefits of something is greater than marginal cost, we should choose to do more of it. So for society, we should choose all the quantities in this range, but the market doesn't factor in that additional benefit. So the market stopped at a quantity that was too low. Once again, what would I want more of if I was society? Market stops at 55. Society wanted a higher quantity. So what direction does my dead weight loss triangle point to? The right. Less technical way of remembering. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So here's my dead weight loss. Just to kind of give you another way of thinking about this. Anytime I want to find my dead weight loss with a positive externality, if I identify it correctly, what is the height of my dead weight loss triangle always going to represent? The external benefit. What is the base of that triangle always going to represent? The difference between that efficient point for society and the point that the market chooses, or the equilibrium quantity, however you want to think about that. Now, because we have linear supply and demand curves, this isn't dead weight loss. Dead weight loss is always going to be a triangle, so we have this multiplied by 1/2. But you kind of see what dead weight loss incorporates is the fact that we have this additional benefit that we're not realizing, we're not experiencing because the market chose a quantity that was too low. The valuation of dead weight loss comes from the fact that we aren't seeing this external benefit for all of the units that we're underproducing by. Just like dead weight loss with a negative externality came from the fact that we were having negative surplus from all of these units that were being overproduced. So negative, well, we can compare this way. Taxes and subsidies were like the exact opposite. Right? Taxes hurt consumers, producers, but still cause dead weight loss. It's just that we were seeing underproduction. Subsidies caused a benefit to producers and consumers, and that came from that created dead weight loss because we had overproduction. Negative and positive externalities work in a similar way. Negative externalities, the market chose a quantity that was too high, or we had dead weight loss that came from overproduction. Positive externalities, the market chose a quantity that was too low, so we had dead weight loss to society created by underproduction. So it's kind of like similar things, but they work in the exact inverse. So we said with with a negative externality, we actually wanted the quantity to be lower so we could use a tax. Here, if society wants to get to a higher quantity, what's one way we can push the market to a higher quantity? Subsidies. So that kind of leads us a little bit of foreshadowing in the next class, where we'll kind of draw this out, and you might even be able to already kind of envision it. But we're going to have for negative externalities what we call corrective taxes and corrective quotas. For positive externalities, how do we get the market to a higher quantity? We're going to have corrective subsidies. So I kind of talked through subsidies and taxes like a bad thing because they were creating dead weight loss in the market. But what could they do for society? Well, if there was dead weight loss in society, we don't care about each individual market. We care about society overall. Taxes and subsidies, even though they cause dead weight loss to the market, they're creating even more gain to society by moving us towards this efficient quantity for society. Taxes and subsidies aren't evil. What we've talked about to this point, they look kind of bad. But maybe, we're taxing certain goods because there's negative externalities. And this is a weird one where even if, so I'll use an example first of pollution, right? If the oil production is causing a negative externality, which is generating dead weight loss for society, what might I want to do? Tax the production of oil, right? We then end up at a point that's better for society. Now, another way of thinking about this, sometimes the external benefits and the external costs don't actually have to be the people outside market. So this is where I'm giving you a little bit like real world connection. I'm not going to like phrase questions in this way on the quiz or the exam. But sometimes people are bad at evaluating the costs and benefits that exist. So in the market for higher education, it's not that maybe you're a better, even if you weren't, if you were going to be benefiting society once you get your college degree, you might not actually realize what your total benefit of your college degree is. You're only thinking it through the lens of your own life. So what the government wants to do is make you realize what the total value of your college degree is. It's the value to your life, but it's also the value of everybody else in society. You've incorrectly identified the marginal benefits that exist because you only factored in what benefits your life. If you factored in what benefits society, more people should be getting a college degree. What's one way we can incentivize more people to get a college degree? Subsidies, right? And maybe this is people of low income, so you get subsidized loans, you get different grants, but that would be kind of the general idea, trying to connect this to like real world topics. Okay. Any questions over positive externalities, anything we kind of looked at either here or thinking about on our slides? Okay. So we got one more thing I want to look at, which is this in-class quiz, which will show up under the quiz tab now or under the home page on module 7. So this is where, let me change the due date real quick. We're going to have this be at 10:50. I'm then going to go up and save this. Re-enter the quiz. And I'll give you the code, which I believe is 93.64. Okay, so 93.64 will get you into that quiz, right? If you guys didn't hate me enough already, I graduated from Purdue in both undergrad and graduate school, so that was the score of the Purdue IU game. Had to rub it in a little bit. You guys won the first one, so I, can't. Once again, don't hate me too much. I still root for IU outside of when they play Purdue. But all right, let's think through some of these questions. And here's where I'm feeling kind of generous today. Again, in-class quizzes, the meant to kind of get you to start thinking. So as I'm beginning to talk through these, I'd read the question, start thinking how I would solve this. Don't just kind of sit back and wait for the answer, right? Also, getting people worried about their exam scores. You've seen a select number of people who are sleeping through class. That might be another thing to make sure they're going to get the class. Okay, so if I'm looking at this model, right, what do I have existing? If the marginal social cost is above my supply curve, what type of externality exists? Well, if the cost of society is higher, I have it's only negative and positive externalities. You can think about it, if there's higher cost, that's a bad thing or a negative externality. How would I find the valuation of that negative externality? Well, if I've got the cost producers and I have the cost to society, what's the difference between those two things? Simply the value of the negative externality or the external cost. So if I'm looking at this curve, I could technically choose any two quantities, and the difference between my supply curve, which represents those private marginal costs, and my marginal social costs, that difference represents the external costs. So here, if I look at a quantity of 60, that's what? 55 and 40. So the value of my negative externality or my external cost would be $15. Now I could choose other quantities. Hopefully I get the same value. So at this quantity of 50, marginal social cost was 50. Producer's marginal cost was 35. Sure enough, that difference is $15. I can choose any quantity, and because we're using linear demand, linear supply curve, linear shifts, we're always going to find that same valuation. Now, I use the same picture in the second question, but before we get there, what point would the market choose? What quantity would the market choose here? wherever supply is equal to demand, which here would be a quantity of 60. Now, this is where start with intuition, and then we'll go to the graphs. If I have a negative externality, is society going to want the quantity to get higher or lower than the market? Well, the market doesn't factor this in. So if there's an additional cost not factored in, once you include that cost, you should see the market want to do less of it, right? So the efficient quantity for society, if you can identify the equilibrium of the market, which hopefully at this point we know that's where supply is equal to demand, then the efficient point for society, once they factor in this external cost, it should be they want a quantity that's low. So the market is overproducing. Where does society want this to be? Where the marginal social cost is equal to the marginal social benefit. Now, I didn't include it on this graph, but if I only have a negative externality, what is my marginal social benefit? There's no positive externality, so it's simply the private marginal benefits or my demand. So that marginal social benefit would be equal to my marginal social cost at a quantity of 50. So we'll kind of use this information to answer the next question, which what's the value of deadweight loss in this market? Okay. So how do we think about deadweight loss? If I have a negative externality, the market is going to be overproducing. So society wants that quantity to be lower. What direction should my deadweight loss triangle point to? The left, right? We want less. Now, why is that the case, though? That's not a technical way of remembering, of knowing why deadweight loss is what it is. Well, if the market is producing 60 units and the efficient point for society is at 50, well, we know that the last unit that society would choose is where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So for every unit past that point that the market chooses, where supply is equal to demand, or where the private marginal costs are equal to the private marginal benefits, every unit in this range, the marginal social costs are greater than the marginal social benefits. So for every unit here that the market produces, that's going to generate, well, if the social costs are greater than the social benefits, that's going to be negative surplus to society. So that triangle, the difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit, for every single unit that the market overproduced, that's going to represent our deadweight loss. We said the height of that triangle will always be the value of the negative externality, which here was what, 15? The base will always be the number of units that we are seeing overproduced by the market. So 15 times 10, and then I always have linear supply and demand curves, so that's going to be always the area of a triangle. 15 times 10 times 1/2, right? So that'd be what? 150 times a half is what, 75, right? So we should be able to kind of answer both those questions. So we mark them, but we thought through them. So if we're paying attention, those should have been relatively easy. So you've got till 10:50 to make sure you hit submit on that. Otherwise, pick up on this externality idea next class. Go a little more in depth. I have my regular office hours tomorrow. Also, the answer to the first 5 quiz questions. All right, guys, this is where it's giving me a little bit of time to end class, okay? So we'll pick up here next class. I'll see you on Thursday. All right, get out of here.